Hello and welcome to Moral Mayhem. Today we are back with Bryan Caplan, this time not to discuss immigration, but to discuss his essay, Don't Be a Feminist. And I think that to start it all off, I just wanted to ask Bryan, what inspired you to write this for your daughter? And what was the general motivation behind it? And why did you want to focus on feminism in particular?
Yeah, I've been thinking about feminism for a long time, and it's only when I had my fourth child that had a daughter, and once I had her, like, well, what should I tell her about this? I figured that she's going to come and ask me one day, and I wanted to be ready, so I took these thoughts that had been mulling in my head for 20 years or so, and wrote them down. She still hasn't read it, actually, but we have had some conversations about it.
I'm sure it'll become relevant soon enough. So, the core, or not the core, but one of the things that I think has generated a lot of debate on Substack and other places is the specific definition which you advance of feminism. So you make the point, which I agree with, that when you say something like feminism means you think men and women should be treated equally or both deserve respect or whatever, that is a definition that almost everybody in 21st century North America agrees with.
Hmm.
And yet not everybody identifies as a feminist.
Correct.
And so your point is, if it's a definition that fails to identify one group versus another, it's not a very good definition. So I agree with that part. And the definition that you advance is that feminism is the view that men and women are not treated equally.
Well, so I specifically said it's the view that our society generally treats men more fairly than women.
Right.
Or fairly rather than equally, but which is a little bit more of a morally loaded term. And again, also built in my definition is everybody gets treated unfairly at some point. That's just human society. But specifically that men are getting a fairer treatment overall than women are.
Right. And yeah, so one point to make at the outset is, when we talk about feminism, I think one of the reasons that there's difficulty coming up with a good definition that people agree with is that what the expression of a belief in gender equality or a concern about gender equality actually looks like in practice depends on your views on a whole host of other important things. So feminism on its own is not really its own worldview, right? Like to understand what a feminist actually thinks, you need to know whether they believe that there are biological sex differences. You need to know what their view of the value of free markets is, and et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that's one place where, while I agree with you that, saying feminism is just about believing in gender equality is not a satisfying definition, it is hard to find more than that sort of ties all the different types of feminists, past and present, together. So yeah, how do you view feminism? Like, I think when you talk about feminism, you're talking about what I term like mainstream contemporary feminism. And how do you see somebody like a Louise Perry or, first wave feminists or whomever? And do you think that they fit the definition which you present?
Yeah, I think that Louise, so I know her work well, so I'll say I think that she definitely fits into my definition of feminist. First generation, so you're talking about like suffragettes?
Yeah.
Or like even pre-suffragettes. I'm going to say that I haven't read them closely enough to be confident. I suspect they do. But I would actually back up and say, I think that you can accept or reject the definition that I'm offering, just saying this is a general idea that ties all these groups together without actually taking a stand on the issues, because one can say this is what feminism means without actually having while being open-minded about what the answer is. A lot of what my complaint is, look, this definition of feminism is the view that men and women should be treated equally. This is one, again, like you said, almost everyone agrees with this. And that's not just speculation. We actually even have survey evidence that I quote in the piece saying, like, yes, that's true. It's like we're talking about almost everybody, regardless of whether they say they're feminist or not, agrees with this. But on some of the things you were saying, like, well, it depends on whether you think there are biological differences between men and women. What I would say is, that does not, you can say, look, this is what feminism means, and then as to whether you actually are going to say I'm a feminist or not, then it does matter whether you think there's biological differences. So if you see that men are doing a lot better in, say, mixed gender tennis, one story is it's because the referees are being unfair to women. Another story is that men have a biological advantage. Right? In that case, if you believe the first theory, then, well, that would be consistent with feminism. And if you believe the second story, then you say, well, I guess that's at least one less reason to be a feminist.
I guess it's a little bit like if you polled Americans on whether they identify with the word social justice, most people would reject identification with that. But most people in America would say that, people regardless of their color and race should be treated fairly. And it seems sort of similar to that, where there's the equality thesis is something that most people buy into, but then the people who identify as that term are selected for some other stuff that the rest of us want to distance ourselves from.
Yeah, I want to talk
Right.
about the.
I mean, I'd say, sorry, just.
No, go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, I'd say, so the main difference is that, feminism is such a mainstream term that almost everybody will use it without really thinking about it. Social justice, even today, it's a little bit academic. And I mean, I think there's still probably half Americans would say, yeah, well, I think society should be just, sure. And it's like, no. This is like social justice trademark. And it comes with a big package of other ideas associated with it. You need to use a word like woke to get something that I think most people would say, oh, that's what you have in mind. But yeah, I think the general point of there is some very bland version that almost everyone agrees with, whether or not they accept the label. And then there is the doctrinally rich version that is making a lot of controversial claims about how society works. And I think in both cases combined with some pretty thinly veiled intimidation of you better not actually argue with me very hard or else I'm going to get mad.
Yeah, I think that, I agree on the intimidation thing, and I do think, it's a lot easier for me to talk about this topic than it is for the two of you in some ways. But even
I'm past all that.
yeah, no, you're past all that. But still, that
like Vaish, I don't know where you feel,
we'll
but
find out.
I'm done being afraid.
But one thing, I want to go back to the fairness specific point of it in a second. I do agree with you. You're right that regardless of whether your feminist acts look really differently, you can still come to an agreed upon definition. But one other note is just how focused are you on this? So like when I think about who identifies as a feminist, it isn't just about what they believe, it's about how focused they are on that specific problem. So in the survey data that you mentioned, I'm pretty sure the most men within that survey, even though a very small percentage of them are identifying as feminists, most of them have a positive view of the women's movement. Whether that means they have a positive view of, the 2025 version of feminism that is ascendant in Gen Z is a different story. But, there's lots of people who are supportive of it, but they're not identifying with it because to them, it's not a big part of their political focus or, just not something they spend as much time thinking about. So I think that, and I think other people have said this too, that that's an important part of the definition too, is like that you are actively interested in analyzing how gender relations could be improved and on both, whether that's positive sum or not. But yeah, so what do you think about that?
I mean, I'd say that it's very much like Christians. So you could say, look, a Christian is just someone who says that this Christianity stuff is basically right, and they don't need to really attend church or convert people or talk about it. And then there's the real Christian. But a true Christian, the real Christian, would be going to church and would be reading the Bible and would be trying to make converts. And my view of there is, all right, well, there's two definitions. The one where you just say, if you agree with it, then it counts, is the main one. And then the intense one where you've got to actually be thinking about it a lot, doing something about it. That's one where you might add on, like it's the true, or it's like the committed. But I would still say that the looser one is the one that fits popular usage. And then for the strict one, it's more like an activist, or what would we say, like a church-going Christian, something like that, where you underscore that it is, like you said, a big part of the way they think about themselves. mean, another way to think about the survey evidence is the survey just says, like, do you consider yourself a feminist? Which is very different from, like, list the 3 identities that matter most to you. And I think you're right that when you ask the first way, then you're going to get a much higher number than if you do it the second way, where a lot of people would say, well, maybe I'm a Democrat or Republican is the most important thing, or my religion, or my occupation, or something like that. So yeah, so probably the share of the population that would put feminist as one of their top 3 identities is pretty low. But on the other hand, the share that just say, I am. And by the way, so I think we are up to about 25% or so of men calling themselves feminists too. So it's not just a microscopic share of them.
I mean, I don't know what part of that is signaling to get laid and what part is genuine, but yeah.
You can tell us.
Come on, like they think that the person on the other end of the interview is going to date them. Probably a little too much. So, like, you may say methinks they doth protest too much. All right, there's probably something going on there, but like let me put it this way: I don't think that most young male Democrats are just faking to get to meet women.
Yeah.
There's probably 10, 20%, but like 50% is a bit too conspiratorial, I think.
I don't know if you guys wanted to linger on the definitional point, but I wanted to. It seems like there's sort of a descriptive component of it and a normative component of it, right? Like so, and I think, Bryan, your definition is sort of like anchored around the descriptive claim of how society treats women now.
Well, not quite, because I specifically do put in the treats men more fairly than women, so that fairness is normative.
Right. No,
although again, there's a background of, well, what is fair treatment of a person? And it's like, well, you don't go and pay someone 30% less money for doing the same job just because they're born a different gender.
Right. I mean, there's a normative element in the descriptive claim, but I mean, the belief is one of, is this the current state of affairs, right? Like, are women being treated unfairly, no matter how you define unfairly? But just to back up a bit, what is your kind of like a view on the historical treatment of women? Would you say it's incontrovertibly true that they've been treated worse, or do you think it's just complicated?
Yeah, I'd say it's complicated. A lot of the evidence that people put forward is very poor evidence, because you just start by saying how terrible life was for women in the 19th century, and it's like, okay, that's all true, but guess what? Life was terrible for men in the 19th century. If you go and talk about, there's women who are taking care of 6 kids with primitive technology, and they're working 80 hours a week. All right, well, let's go and take a look at what their husbands are doing, and you'll also see they're working extremely long number of hours under very harsh conditions. Again, it's also one where you can say, well, like, we can make a list of ways in which women were treated less fairly, but let's be complete and let's make a list of all the ways in which men were treated less fairly. So the most obvious ones historically would be getting conscripted and being a lot more likely to get murdered in large-scale violence, that kind of thing. So I think this is not a small issue. It's not just a dodge. I think it is pretty central. Definitely, if you think about the U.S. before 1970, and you make a list of ways in which women were being treated worse, you can say, well, guess what? There was conscription. Men are getting enslaved for a year or 1 or 2 years, and not enslaved to go and just wait tables, like getting put into combat, like pretty much close to the worst kind of slavery you can have.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that conscription is a very morally problematic thing. One thing that this whole discussion brings up is, to your point, how difficult it is to decide who is being treated more fairly now or in the past or whatever. And part of that is because there are infinite things that you could judge fairness on. Part of it is that people have different value hierarchies of things they care about. But I think it has been true that women's liberties have been restricted more on the basis of sex than men's have. And I think that aspect, and like, some people will not find that very motivating because they are more concerned about safety and security than they are about liberty. And I've had comments on Substack pieces I've written where people were like, I'd much rather have been a 18th century woman than a 18th century man. And that could be valid. I mean, my personal biases are that I would much rather have the less restricted liberties. But yeah, and I think just this whole thing is why focusing on it being about fairness, I think, is at least incomplete and problematic. Like, I get that the fairness component to me is about motivation. So for somebody to be identified as a feminist, they need to have some kind of motivation. They need to want something to change generally. I don't think that it's typically just that you believe that men and women should be treated equally and you think they are treated equally. Those are the people who believe in it but don't identify as a feminist generally. So you
Right.
need
Or again, probably just wouldn't call themselves a feminist if they just said, look, our society treats men and women equally, and I'm a feminist. It's like, so you got no complaints?
Right.
No, everything's great. Then, again, it would at least be odd, right? And, and again, in terms of the background of the definition we're proposing, here's what I would say. Like, if we just imagine someone saying, I'm a feminist, but I don't believe in that men are treated more fairly on the job. I don't believe that men are treated more fairly in relationships. I don't believe that men are treated more fairly in the division of household tasks. And they just go through the list of all the main things that feminists have complained about and to say, I don't agree with any of those. It's like, well, then what sense are you a feminist? And that's what I would say is one of the main debates that I've had with feminists where I mean, strangely, they first say, like, Bryan, your definition's garbage. And second of all, here's 20 ways that our society treats men more fair than women. And I'm like, well, why not just accept my definition and then we can argue about the cases? But it's kind of odd to reject the definition and then also say I'm wrong because I'm ignoring these facts, which, I'll say the facts are actually, at minimum more complicated than they're saying, or I think often they're just totally wrong on the facts, like on the pay gap.
Right. I mean, I'm more or less a feminist who would say I don't think women are being treated particularly unfairly in those specific examples. I mean,
Then what would you say is left?
one of the ways that I think about the benefit of having a women's movement or a feminist focused movement is, I do believe that there are biological sex differences between men and women. And I think that those make it such that women's voices are going to be less heard in the public sphere. And so, and Louise Perry's written something similar to one of the articles I wrote on this. But the idea being that given you believe there are sex differences, you're going to expect those representation differences to continue into the future. And assuming that you think women might have a different perspective on social issues or economic issues or whatever it is that is being underrepresented, having a feminist analysis or movement or way of communicating those things could have a social value, which is partly to preserve sort of the liberties that we've secured through like earlier parts of feminism, but also to communicate issues that are unknown. So like, I don't know, I've read some like early first wave feminist stuff where they were arguing for the right to vote on the basis not of fairness, but of social benefit. So saying that as women working in the home, they see things going on in the neighborhoods, they see things going on with food preparation, et cetera, that are like missed by the people making decisions. And they wanted to have a way to add that information to the public consciousness, essentially.
Yeah, that just seems quite strained, actually. I mean, here's the thing. If you thought that it just wasn't true that your group was being mistreated, then why should you have more voice? Seems like, well, what would be achieved with having more voice? I guess you could imagine that you would just have some special knowledge for the good of all, but that doesn't seem that has much to do with what feminists actually advocate for. It seems like it is very much we want to go and do more for women and make sure that women are getting better treatment. If you're already getting treatment that's as good as you deserve, why should you get anything else?
One point I'll make against myself is that the women who are most active in feminist movements tend to be self-selected to be atypical women. So that is a point against the point that both Louise Perry and I have made, which is, if the idea is that homemakers and all these kind of women are not being represented, are the women who are active in feminist movement actually going to be able to represent those specific women who are most underrepresented and who might have actually special knowledge, which could maybe and this will take us back to the fairness thing, but it's not always about, bringing women up and bringing men down or whatever. There are things where feminists think that both men and women can benefit from a change in norms.
So there is that idea in the rhetoric, but in terms of what it really means, it's hard to see what major feminist proposals would actually, like, if they were implemented, like how exactly would men gain from this? There's some idea of then men would feel free to go into traditionally feminine occupations or something like that.
So Brian, wouldn't you like? So let me. I think my point will be slightly self-defeating, but that's the point, which is you could imagine like an alternate world in which as Reagan pointed out, there's all these women that have noticed that a lot of their work is like an unpriced positive externality, right? Like bringing kids into the world and taking care of them. And proposing policy pro-natalist policy positions. Obviously what we're getting is the opposite. So I think I was like, when Reagan first made this argument, I thought like there was something there in terms of the, like there's a lot of less legible things that women like just by virtue of being part of the family unit and taking care of kids, you, like a lot of your well-being metrics are probably like much looser approximated by like the metrics we are optimizing for as a society. So there's one could plausibly make that case, but then what you see is the feminist movement often tends to be just for those same sex difference reasons, you probably get like outliers who represent women. And I don't know if that like completely explains kind of what a median feminist's positions are, because I think it's like some mix of that and just being completely co-opted and corrupted by just the social justice ideology, which frankly, a lot of what feminists talk about now is just intersectional politics, and I can't really like divorce it from any of the other nonsense.
I mean, I say that if your idea is that like women have some special knowledge that needs to be shared, then I said, well, how about just defend it on its merits? When you go and have a movement saying like this is a feminist movement and women in general have been treated less fairly, and also I have some useful information to provide, it is really muddying the message. Right. And then again the idea that like in general you would want groups that groups to organize so they can be ready to share their knowledge. It's like, so would you want to have a really active political Irish movement in America? And it's like, well, we really need to get the perspectives of the Irish here because they might know something the rest of us don't know. And it's like, I guess they might, but like, what exactly is that? Is the most likely scenario that the Irish group will just be specifically promoting things that they think are better for the Irish?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we have reason to believe that women will be underrepresented in ways that do not track their sort of benefit to society, which I don't know that you can make as strong of a case for with other groups.
So like, what would be an example?
I mean, the childcare aspect. So, women are doing socially valuable work, which takes them out of the social sphere. Therefore, they're less a part of discussions that affect everyone. And in terms of, I did want to
Are they? Like, you might also say that by virtue of not having full-time jobs, they have more time to be talking about this. Definitely in terms of like local politics, school boards, things like that, which is one of the biggest things that happens in our society. Women are overrepresented, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. I just wanted to quickly on the how can men benefit thing, or the positive sum aspect. I do think there's some good examples here. Like, I think men have benefited from being more involved in childcare. For example, I think men and women have the potential to have better romantic relationships than they did in the past. And
Well, potential, sure, but like, does it even seem true that they are better than in 1960? I mean, we've got we do have quite a bit of data on
think
relationship
so.
satisfaction that goes back to those times. So definitely in terms of share of the population that's happily married, we're much worse than 1960.
Yes, but we've also, the divorce rate has come down a little bit from right
Right.
after.
Well, a lot of it just from not marrying in the first place.
Yes, I also, yeah, I mean, I'm unsure on that. I guess my personal experience just looking at people of different generations is that younger people's marriages seem better. But yes, they are also more picky. So it could just be that I'm seeing the better quartile or whatever. But
I mean, the way that I explain it to my daughter is, having harmonious romantic relationships is hard enough without one person having a philosophy that men in general have been mistreating women. So again, of course, if it's true, then you might say, well, it may make it harder, but it's true. Like another analogy I like is this. So imagine that you have a friend who totally unfairly, someone just rammed into them in a car accident and they can't walk. Right now, here's a case where they genuinely been treated unfairly, and even then, it doesn't seem very productive to say that they should dwell on how unfairly they've been treated, and it's really important to go and focus on that. And then imagine that it turns out that it wasn't, it was actually their own fault, or it was just bad luck. They were struck by lightning and no one did anything unfairly to them. That's a case where it's not even true that you were treated unfairly, and also you were putting a lot of your emotional energy and thought into feeling like a victim instead of just trying to move forward with life.
Yeah, I definitely agree that spending time feeling like a victim is a negative. I guess, my experience of growing up where both my parents identified as feminists was the version of feminism that I was exposed to was all about taking agency and not feeling like you have to succumb to stereotypes or societal expectations.
And so how would your parents have felt if you said, told them, yeah, I want to be a stay-at-home mom? Would that be agency too, or does feminism require that you go and pursue a career?
I mean, I don't know how they would have felt about that in my.
Would they been freaked out?
If I said that now, they would definitely be supportive, though.
Yeah, but at 18, if 18, would they
At
have been freaked out?
18, I think, well, but I actually wouldn't be supportive of that either. Not because I think it's a bad life. I think it's a great life to be a stay-at-home mom if you have the financial situation that makes that possible. But I think that if you, I do actually think there's a pretty big cost to setting up your life in a way where you're unable to be independent.
So there is this other story that quite a few economists have been pushing that the optimal strategy might really be for career women to have kids early when they're young and have a lot of energy, and then actually focus on their careers 5 or 10 years later, and then they don't get interrupted in their career because they've already had their kids. I mean, it's an alternate plan, and I think it's one that is far from crazy. Actually, I know it's unusual, but I mean, definitely if you are very supportive of female agency, if your daughter comes and says they want to try this, it's like, well, maybe it would be a good idea, possibly.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I have one friend who did that. It wasn't her, it wasn't like a scripted out plan, but that is sort of how it worked out. Yeah, I think there's benefits to that. My parents essentially did that. They had me so young and then went to school after, and it all worked out eventually. But it was a tough 20s. It was not like the same kind of experience of your 20s that I had.
Right, although possibly much easier 30s.
Easier, I would say definitely easier. Yeah, easier 30s. Their 40s were their adolescence, basically. But yeah, I mean, where was I?
Who's to say if that was better or worse?
Yeah, it's hard to say. It is hard to say. I agree with that. I do think that choosing your partner is easier when you are a little bit older, but people disagree on that too. But I also have a strong bias on that because of personal experience.
Yeah, I guess I want to I want to get your thoughts on this because maybe we have different intuitions. Because I think that there is something. Because economic power gives you, obviously it's not a substitute for utility or well-being, right? But it does give you sort of like negotiating power and optionality in the future. And I think if you just took an outside view on sort of like how this division of labor, like the traditional division of labor, would play out, I mean, I think at least in each, and I'm not talking about what the socially optimal thing is, but in each individual case, can you really blame women for wanting to strengthen their negotiating position by like building career capital, for example?
I wouldn't criticize anyone for doing that, but if they were to say, let's form a movement saying that women have been mistreated because we are less likely to be full-time workers, that would be where I would stop and say, well, is that even true? And like, why is it that you're so convinced of that? Yeah, so by the way, since we got Vice here and we're talking about this, our arranged marriage. All right, so I'm not sure how, like, is it common in Kerala, or is it actually more or less common than the rest of India?
Yeah, I mean it's still fairly. I mean the
Right.
rates are still fairly high, like relative to any other place in the world.
Right now, you probably know that native-born Americans just think it's crazy to have arranged marriage.
Right.
And yet, when I've talked to people who know about it, as well as read research on it, the results are very counterintuitive to native-born Americans. Like, yeah, actually, it turns out that arranged marriages if anything, are a bit more successful, and not just successful by the standards of the parents are happier, but the couple themselves report higher marital satisfaction. And then it's the kind of thing where, again, outsiders would say, well, this must be all about the oppression of women. And then you learn more about it, and it's like, it's much more complicated than that. And like, why, like how is it that you think you know this? And even why don't you go and talk to some people with a real experience and look at the data instead of pontificating?
Let me give you
what's your reaction to that?
Let me give you my reaction, which is like a little bit facetious, but I think gets to one concern I have with that line of reasoning. There are also people in India people I know very well, who tell me they are very sure out of like the 500 people they know, no one is gay, right? And so this is, as you can tell, this is probably because not because they don't know any gay people, but because they don't identify as gay. And so,
wait, they're closeted, or they have some other self-classification?
yeah, no, because they're closeted, and many of them still like get married and pursue opportunities outside, et cetera, et cetera. But I think, anyway, that's just an extreme case just to illustrate the underlying point, which is when I read about the arranged marriage stats being, better or even, just non-conclusive. I don't know what I should infer from that, because like the social cost to exiting marriages is still much higher. So it's like the social cost of like exiting a marriage is much higher, right? So the social cost of divorce, for example, and so
I mean, of course, so like Indian Americans who are much less likely to be having arranged marriages, they also have rock bottom divorce rates, right?
Oh, is that right? I didn't know that. Yeah.
But you're saying the social cost would be higher in their communities too. Although the social cost being higher could make marriages better, right? Like that's not an obvious negative
Like,
per se.
I mean, it's real tempting to say, okay, this means people are trapped in horrible
Right.
marriages. On the other hand, it might mean that people try harder to make it work.
But
I
would
mean,
we
I
say that
think of
about
it
any other
as-
contract? I totally get it. I think I don't think it's conclusive, but I do think,
Based on your experience, do you even find it plausible that arranged marriage is terrible, despite what the social science evidence says?
yeah, it's interesting. I think I certainly have seen the side of it that your side of the argument seems to support, meaning like
Okay.
my parents' marriage probably got better over time, right? Not worse. But what does that mean for like the average? Like, I also have plenty of friends whose parents don't have great relationships, but which is also the case here. So I don't really know that like my anecdotal experience tells us anything useful.
Really, so don't underrate any like firsthand experience. I mean, this is the thing so social scientists, of course, always dismiss, or like they're trained to dismiss firsthand experience. And I say, look, firsthand experience is way better than forming your beliefs based on the news. Firsthand experience, firsthand experience says that terrorism almost never happens. The news says it happens all the time. And guess which one is actually true? And I think that's generally the case with firsthand experience as compared to the distortions you'll get from the media. Firsthand experience is an oracle.
That's true if I believed I was like somewhere. Like I think the problem is, especially with Indian Americans, when you talk to them, it's just such a. There's so many selection effects that it's like hard to actually think that is the median experience. So especially how liberal your family is and all these sorts of things. Like for example, my parents could plausibly get like they get divorced if they had a terrible marriage, and like people around us have. But I'm sure there are sort of like social settings where the cost is prohibitive, right? So and then sure that's still not like good evidence of people being in a terrible place, because you could make the argument that those trad social norms probably could confer some other benefits, right? Which people like us don't get. So
yeah. Or also, if you just look at divorced couples and say, wow, at least one of the people after the divorce is doing terribly, right? The stronger norm would have prevented that anyway.
So yeah, that gets to okay. I have a couple thoughts about arranged marriages. One is I think that
good. Let's get sidetracked.
I've thought about this because I mean, I only know a couple of couples in arranged marriages now, and they are definitely not worse than American marriages from my anecdotal experience. And my American anecdotal experience is also within a group that, can get divorced more easier relative to the average American and things like that. So a couple of things is one, I think that going off of Brian's last point, there's probably less dispersion in outcomes than there is in, marriages here. And I think we're moving even more in that direction, especially when you're like looking at fewer marriages happening at later ages. I think some of those have the potential to be extremely high quality in a way that the median arranged marriage probably is not. However, I think that what the data suggests to me and the anecdotal experiences suggest to me is that whatever makes you fall in love is just not super predictive of what's going to make you have a happy, stable partnership 30 years later. And that, your mom and your grandma can probably do a better job at that, especially when you're young, than, you can by dating. So I think that when we're talking about, women having children earlier, I do think we need to have families involved in those decisions. If my daughter wanted to have kids and then go to college or something like that, or have kids right after college and then pursue a career, I would be much more opinionated about her partner than I would be if she did it a different way. And I think that's just
Yeah, reasonably so. Sure.
reasonable.
And you would be more on the hook, right? Like you would be there
Yeah,
taking care of the
I would
baby.
be more
Yeah,
on the
right.
hook. Yeah, I would be more. I would want to be more involved.
Yeah.
The other thing I would
Oh, and
say,
there's also like you're a lot less mature, so your
yeah,
judgment is good. And I'm at least gonna, you may not listen, but I'm gonna tell you what I think
yeah,
anyway.
like I would. Whereas, if my daughter was in her, the New York age to get married is like 32. So, if she was 32 and getting married, I'd probably assume I could be a little more hands off depending on how she made other decisions. The other thing I'd say is I don't think, yes, Americans do think arranged marriages are crazy, but I have heard more young people talking about working with matchmakers. Also, the show Love is Blind is essentially
Yeah.
a arranged marriage show where they're trying to arrange their
It's
own marriages with
a
along with
little.
producers of Netflix producers. I think if you do want an arranged marriage, you probably should ask your mom and grandma rather than the producers of a Netflix show to help you facilitate that. But but I do think there's like, people are frustrated with the process costs, for lack of a better term, involved with building relationships. And I think that people are more open to these kind of options because, for whatever reason, blame the apps, blame COVID or whatever you want to blame, people are finding it not fun to date. That feedback seems to be pretty clear.
So since we're running short on time, do you just want to go through some of the main complaints that feminists have had, and we can see what you guys think about them?
Sure.
All right, so we've got the pay gap right now. So this is one which is motivating for me because as an economist, I know a lot about it. And I know on the one hand, you've got your misleading advocacy statistics as saying women are getting paid 20 or 30 cents less than the dollar. And then basic economics says, well, let's go and compare apples to apples. So men are a lot more likely to be not only working full time, a lot more likely to be working more than full time. Men are more likely to be majoring in STEM. Men are more likely to go and do jobs that are just very unpleasant because they want to make money and don't care so much about quality of life. So, do you have any? Are you similarly skeptical of the reality of the gender pay gap once you really look into it, or what do you think?
I don't think we're going to argue with you on that, but
Yeah, not going to argue on that. I also, there's the men's rights perspective, which goes even further than what you said, which is like, and I think there's some validity to this, which is, women choosing lower paid careers is a sign of female privilege in that they're not going to be judged as harshly for having lower earning potential on the dating market, and so they have this opportunity to pursue more fulfilling ways of spending their time. And I do think there's something to that.
yeah, there's
So
this
yeah,
article
not
that
arguing on that one.
I think you might remember, Regan, there was this article we read. I forget who it was. It was on Substack. And she goes through a bunch of like data and says, oh, these are the professions, and this is the representation of men and women. And hence, we can conclude that women obviously care more about the world and improving the world because they're in all these professions. And it's like, and I've actually just even anecdotally validated it with like friends who work in nonprofits and stuff. Like almost invariably, these like intellectually stimulating plus like feel good jobs have way more women in them, and if you ask them what their husbands are doing, they're making money in finance or consulting. So there's a lot of that going on where like uh, we're not pricing in just like the subjective experience of doing the job and like
Yeah.
how that favors women.
Yeah. Yes, like another one is division of household chores. So this is one where there's this time diary research, and the standard result is that if you add up all paid and unpaid labor, then again, it is not true that women have a harder deal overall. There's some heterogeneity where basically single moms seem to actually have a really tough time. But the flip side of that is stay-at-home moms who don't have jobs have an especially easy time. And then you average it all together, and you get, I mean, it's very similar. And then the main critique of this is just that there's a lot of things of work that men do that just doesn't get counted as men's work. Things like being the family driver when you're on a trip, that sort of thing, where it's like, well, that's just the man wants to drive and he needs to as a man. And it's like, is it that, or is it more like he feels like that's his role and he has to drive the car? And if you go and put that in, then probably the actual result is men's combined hours of paid and unpaid work is actually higher on average, although, like I said, with quite a bit of variation based upon relationship status.
Don't worry, Brian. I'm pushing back on behalf of all of us, and I make Reagan drive. So this is
That's true.
it's a win.
Yeah, I think there could also be some women's stuff that's not getting counted or mental labor or whatever. But putting that aside, I have written about the statistics. I wrote an article called "Let's Be Honest About the Second Shift," which, basically makes this exact point. The only group, I think it was also that women working where both couples are working, or sorry, where both partners are working full time. I think women's hours are a little bit worse overall. So I think that the full
And they have kids.
yes, and they have kids, married with kids. I think that the full time working woman ended up, doing a little bit more work, but it's also the bigger difference that you see. And I think part of where the spiritual angst comes from is that in their free time, men are spending more time on leisure activities and women are spending more time on personal care activities. That's obviously a personal choice, but I wonder if like women are feeling frustrated that they're not feeling like they're getting real leisure because they're spending time on, I don't know, appearance related efforts and things like that. I do think the only thing I'll say on this is, and this kind of ties in with what we were talking about earlier with the benefits of when you have kids and how that affects your negotiating power and stuff. I do think that, because of the way the split comes out, a lot of women's work is work that sort of benefits the entire family unit equally, and a lot of men's work also mostly benefits the entire family unit. But were they to break up, he's in a better position in that he has legible signals to like external parties of how he can create value. And so,
Although, of course, the usual result of a divorce, if the man is making more money, is he's got to give a sizable share of his money to his ex-wife. Whereas there's not an expectation that she continued to give him any household services, right?
I think that that's only like I think that first of all, I mean, it's alimony
Crucially with kids. You need kids for that to be.
Yeah. But even so, alimony is only rewarded in like a pretty small minority of cases, as far as I know.
So you're right. So you need to be married for these days. You need to be married for quite a long time for there to be significant alimony. But child support is a different story. And obviously, if your income is high, the child support is in fact way more than is really needed for the support of the child.
Yes, that's true. I mean, I'd say that the because of, I mean, I guess my pushback, or maybe pushback's the wrong word, but so many single moms are getting zero of their child support that I'm pretty sure it comes out not unfair to men. And also, even when, you're getting paid alimony, you're saying, you're not providing household services to the man. That might be true, but you're providing most of the child care for the kids, which is, yes, being compensated, but still.
Just on the legible signals argument you made, Reagan, I was just like, the other side of the ledger is that yes, that's true in terms of like mate choice and future mate value. But one other result when couples split up, especially if the divorce is acrimonious, is that like emotionally the women almost always win their kids, right?
That's true.
Because they often get the kids, and then that's sort of at least ideological monopoly in terms of like who gets to frame the narrative and so on. And then again, this isn't actually like a point in the men's favor, because then you'd be like, oh, why is it like that? And it's like, well, women also probably care about that more than, and men will often care about their kids less after they get divorced. So there is sort of this like neat symmetry to this stuff where you think someone's getting fucked over, but it's like mostly because someone cares more or less.
Well, here's a fun one. So since we've been talking about Louise Perry, so she puts a lot of weight in the story of society regards women as childlike. And she says it's not that we're mean to women, it's that we are condescending to women. And I said, okay, there's something to that, but it's a fair point. But there's also a like a presumptive negative way that we treat men, and I call this treating men as beast-like. And looking at men and saying, look at that guy, he's like an animal, and sort of thinking about men in this animalistic way. And I actually did some surveys on this, and most people said, yeah, like, well, both are true. Yeah, so women, they get condescended to, and people think of them as being like children. But men, on the other hand, it's sort of like, oh my God, that guy like might rip me apart. And like, I could just be sort of sitting there eating crackers or something, but still, there's like, oh, look at him, he's like muscular, he's scary, and like, we're not gonna we're just gonna sort of assume the worst out of this guy. And like in both cases, you can say, well, you can kind of understand where people are coming from, but still, if someone says like I'm being misjudged by others, it seems both genders have a reasonable point to make on that score.
I'm sure that these things are directionally true, but I just think a lot of this is, you reap what you sow. Like, a lot of people want to be condescended to because they want the special treatments and they seek those out. And the reason I'm saying, I don't think Louise Perry is condescending to women in general, but like her whole thesis is that women are having all this sex that they don't want to have because they're too scared to say no thank you.
Yeah.
And I find that quite to be treating women like children. So that, and I push back on that thesis generally. But yeah. So
I mean, when I was talking to her, I was just incredulous, and I'm like, who are all these women having sex with guys just to be nice?
they're not. They're not.
Well, then her answer was, well, look, it's only with the very attractive men. And I'm like, all right, so it's not really just to be nice. It's actually like, this is a hot guy and I like him. So it's, so her framing was pretty odd. And in fact, it was one where like, I have never in my entire life heard of such a thing. So and you say it's happening everywhere. I think I would have heard about it.
I mean, I'm sure it does happen sometimes, but it's like the idea that it's a dominant force causing all these negative experiences, I find unlikely. And I also think, I'll give her credit for the advice she gives to counteract it, which is essentially to take agency and avoid situations. Like, either you have to get comfortable taking yourself out of uncomfortable situations, or you have to avoid uncomfortable situations if you recognize that you're unable to do that. So either avoid hookup culture. If you're somebody who's constantly having sexual experiences that you feel negative about, you should just completely opt out of hookup culture. And otherwise, you should try to get better at that. It's a tool that will help you in all kinds of pursuits. So
yeah. And when I was asking her, like, how does everything you're saying fit with all of the survey data saying that sex is near an all-time low? And I don't think she said, okay, well, that's true too. All right, I guess there's some incredible variance, but then it's odd to be so focused just on women having sex they regret rather than just the epidemic of loneliness.
And there's also lots of women having sex they don't regret who would have previously been not having sex because they feared pregnancy and social retribution. So I don't know the exact way to add those things up. But anyway, I wanted to read one quote that I really liked from your piece, and just end maybe with you talking a little bit about how you see the value or lack thereof in gender roles. So one of the things that you said, which I liked, was some feminists may dismiss rationality and justice as male virtues, but that's one of the greatest insults to women ever uttered. Rationality is not a male virtue. Justice is not a male virtue. They are human virtues. And this is something that I've talked about a little bit before too. And I think, because of the red pilling on, hey, sex differences are actually real, people have taken this too far to the degree that, you're suggesting people, saying that women can't say no to sex, suggesting that they need to, do completely different things to be attractive to the other sex, when in reality, there are some small differences. Men care a little bit more about looks, a little bit less about money, a little bit more about social capital, whatever. But generally, like, we want to encourage men and women to be good humans. On the other hand, I do recognize that gender roles serve this benefit of reducing process costs and reducing confusion around who should do what and what you should do in life and what your goals should be. Anyway, just wondering if you have any thoughts on sort of gender roles and how they might, how virtues might differ for men and women and where that's helpful and where it's not.
Yeah, my main thought is it's very helpful to understand what gender roles are so that you can honestly ask yourself, like, does this fit me? And is this actually something that is going to work well for me? And then if it's not, instead of saying our society's so unfair, men are so unfair, women are so unfair, just say, all right, look, I'm unusual and I should go and try to find a match with someone who's on the same page. So I think that's exactly the advice that I give to my daughter in the essay is, like, don't like if you want something that is different from what most people are getting, don't feel like a victim, be proactive. And it is not it is not that hard to be proactive, just to actually talk about what is it you're looking for. I say profile, go and try to get in particular I tell her just avoid just going out with the most extroverted guys who are the ones that women often form their views of all men from, just because those guys are so hard to avoid. And just realize, look, there are an enormous number of shy guys around who have lots of other virtues going for them. And if you just look around and see, all right, so there's a guy who is shy, but everything else works is great, and then just take the initiative. And so that's a lot of my advice is. And what would you even say? So my favorite thing to tell women to say is just, you seem promising. It's not it's not that aggressive, but I would say most men probably go their entire lives without ever hearing that even once. So I think it'll definitely get their attention. Like, I'm promising? How am I promising? Please.
It's funny you say that because we were just Love is Blind comes up again, watching Love is Blind, and this whole thing of women playing hard to get, I'm sure it works in some cases, but a lot of men want female attention and validation. And there was an example where the guy essentially chooses the woman who's more clear with her validation, even though he was leaning towards the other one previously, which I thought was just kind of an interesting example. But yeah, I think women should take more agency in, you don't have to totally gender swap it. You can do subtle things, and so few women are hitting on men that doing something subtle will often work out anyway. And either you're just sitting there waiting for someone who's going to come up to you and ask you out, or you can increase your options by asking people out occasionally. I also
I agree with everything except the subtle thing will work. That's one where most men are just too oblivious. You got to be very direct, is my view. So that's why I just look a guy in the eye and say, you seem promising. It's not a really extreme statement, but I think it would still totally there's almost no guy so oblivious that he would not hear that and just well, wait, what did you just say? And just oh wow.
And one benefit of doing this is if you just think through the scenarios, the case in which someone reacts poorly to that is probably not someone you want to be with anyway. So it's a decent selection there.
True. Yeah, the only other advice, and this applies to both genders, obviously, is you want to be in spaces where the other gender is. But I think it's a lot easier for women to act upon because the male version of that always has the potential of being creepy. You don't want to be the guy who seems like they're going to yoga class to look at women. But you can be the woman who's going to an intellectual event that is male biased to meet men, and men will be happy to see you there.
Yeah, I met Reagan at an event where it was 8 dudes and her, and I was like, now that I didn't go there, I went there for the ideas, right, and just happened to meet her.
So I have not been to church in decades. I wonder whether it's creepy now for a guy even to go to church. My guess is no, and it's still fine.
The women I know who go to church would love for more men to go to church because the men who are there are married.
That one's still okay.
Yeah, because the men who are there are married, and there's a lot of goodwill to people who are going to church, especially if you're going for regularly, right? So.
All right.
Okay, we can.
So can I congratulate you on your recent Indian wedding?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Congratulations on your recent Indian wedding. I'm still waiting for someone to invite me to one because I love Bollywood music. It would be a dream come true to get to go to one.
It was very fun. I want to go to one now because I've only been the bride, and I would love to be a guest at the wedding, which sounds even more fun than being the bride, to be honest.
I mean, it's
But
definitely more fun. Yeah.
but thank you, and thank you so much for coming on again. We are very appreciative of your time. If we didn't already say this in the intro, the backstory here is this is our second run through of the feminism discussion. The first one, I failed to press record, and Bryan graciously gave us another hour of his time to do a round 2.0. So it was
And
great.
I just took a glance, looked over, and said, "Yes, okay, good. Record is on this time." Because I suddenly got paranoid that we were going to have two unrecorded ones, but it was great fun either way.
Okay, well, thank you so
It was
much.
great chatting,
And
Bryan.
Bryan, do you want to tell people where to find you online?
Yeah, absolutely. So the book is called "Don't Be a Feminist: Essays on Genuine Justice." You can get that one on Amazon. It's one of a whole series of books of my collected essays. My Substack is Bet on It, and I just have everything that I've ever done on bcaplan.com. That is B and then CAPLAN.